Welcome to week 13, Thanksgiving week, food, family, friends, and a whole lot of football. The 4 F's this week, and hopefully from the football standpoint, we don't have anything crazy and we can have a nice week where everything goes exactly how we want it to. But of course, that's probably asking too much in 2025. And on Thanksgiving, we will have 3 games, and we are going to kick it off with Green Bay at Detroit, who will kick off at 1 o'clock. The Lions just gave up a ton of yards to Wan'Dale Robinson, and they've been giving up some big plays. Terrion Arnold and Kirby Joseph, they still may not be ready to go this week, and if that happens, you can expect Green Bay to also have some big plays in this game. If you remember back in week 1, they took advantage of that against the Lions, and with Christian Watson seeing a jump in his targets every single week since coming back, he could definitely be the one guy out of this wide receiver core that I trust to have a solid day. He has seen his targets go from 4, 4, 4 to 5 and then 7 last week. He also has at least 40 receiving yards in every game this season. So I would say going up against a defense that's probably going to allow some big plays, Christian Watson would be most likely to have those. Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks could also have decent days, but I don't know if I expect their floor to be nearly as safe as Watson's. Green Bay is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off of a solid week last week with another touchdown, so hopefully he can at least find the end zone again this week. The one thing we know, he'll get plenty of volume, but Jameson Williams is the real question mark here, and probably why you're watching this segment. He now has 2 games in his last 5 where he has 0 fantasy points, and he had a streak of 3 straight games with a touchdown coming into last week. This matchup isn't nearly as good, but the last time J-Mo didn't put up any fantasy points, he bounced back with 3 straight solid games. Let's hope he bounces back again this week. Kansas City at Dallas will be our mid-afternoon game on Thanksgiving, and as of right now, it sounds like Rashee Rice is good to go, but he may have been dealing with a little bit of a hamstring issue at the end of the game last week. As long as he plays, he's definitely a start for us. We'll just go ahead and note that he is dealing with an injury right now. And given the matchup going up against Dallas, who still allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, I think Xavier Worthy could end up being worth a fringe shot this week if you're willing to take the risk for someone that could have some upside. But note this, Dallas's defense has played much better as of recent. Over the last 4 weeks, Dallas has allowed the 7th fewest receptions to opposing wide receivers. However, they are ranked 16th in receiving yards. So even though the receptions are a little bit lower, the big plays are still hitting for opposing teams, which is exactly where Xavier Worthy could end up making his mark this week. In a negative game script last week, he had 8 targets, and what could be a neutral or potentially negative game script at times, this week, Kansas City may have to throw the ball quite a bit, with Xavier Worthy seeing some deeper targets. And even though Kansas City is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game, CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, there's no way we can sit either of these guys. George Pickens didn't practice on Monday. It sounds like a little bit of a knee thing, but no major concerns. He should still end up playing and be just fine. CeeDee Lamb caught 4 of his 11 targets for 75 yards last week, but he had 3 pretty big drops that would have given him a monster day against Philadelphia if he had just held on. George Pickens, another fantastic day. Caught all 9 of his targets for 146 yards and a touchdown. He has been hot. Over his last 6 games, he has at least 70 receiving yards in every game. He has 140 or more receiving yards in each of his last 2 games, with touchdowns in each of those 2 games. And over his last 4 games, he's had 9 or more targets in each of them. George Pickens is absolutely a must start right now, and might actually be the wide receiver 1 in Dallas. The Thursday night game will be Cincinnati at Baltimore, and the return of Joe Burrow is going to create a ton of buzz about this game. So after you get done eating, even if you feel a little bit tired, this game will probably be enough to keep you going. Baltimore is a defense that has also been playing better as of late, but against wide receivers, they're still giving up quite a bit of statistics. Over the last 4 weeks, they still have allowed the 6th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. So even though the defense as a whole has been playing a lot better, they are allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And maybe the ceiling hasn't been there for wide receivers, but the floor definitely has been. And I know fantasy owners are going to be excited to welcome Ja'Marr Chase back this week after, unfortunately, he was suspended last week. Although we do know at this point, T. Higgins will miss in the concussion protocol. Some people might be looking at Mitchell Tinsley this week, who scored a touchdown last week. Some people could be looking to Andre Iosivas. I'm going to go with the guy that has had a connection with Joe Burrow before, Iosivas, and led the team with 7 targets last week. Could Tinsley have a touchdown this week? Potentially, but again, the ceiling's been a little bit lower, but the receiving yards have been solid against Baltimore's defense. Give me Iosivas for a flex spot. How is it that Cincinnati's defense is giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers? Well, that's because they're giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs and tight ends. So opposing wide receivers aren't really needing to have huge days against them. Could Zay Flowers have a solid day? Absolutely. But he continues to be very limited in his fantasy production. He's been outside the top 24 wide receivers in every single game but 2 this season. Chicago and Philadelphia will kick things off on Friday at 3 o'clock for a special Black Friday game. Nobody's going to the store to do their Black Friday shopping anymore. Maybe a few people here and there, but the way to do it is definitely from the warmth and comfort of your own house with fantasy football right in front of you. And if you're ready to dominate 2026, then you should get ready to pre-order our 2026 fantasy football draft guide on Black Friday this week for a huge discount. So make sure you're following the Fantasy Headliners on all of our social media platforms. So then when we post on Friday that our Black Friday deal is live, you can jump in and get your pre-order done right away. So then you're all ready to dominate 2026, even though we haven't even gotten there yet. But also keep in mind, we have been releasing our draft guide much earlier over the last couple of years because we've been including dynasty and rookie evaluations in our draft guide to kick off earlier in the season, even before your redraft leagues are ready to roll. I don't know who's more frustrating to own at this point in time, DJ Moore or Rome Odunze. DJ Moore last week caught 5 of his 7 targets for 64 yards and 2 touchdowns. Which was more touchdowns than combined for the entire season for DJ Moore. Rome Odunze, you got a guy that at the beginning of the season scored 5 touchdowns in his first 4 games. And now he only has 1 touchdown over the course of his last 7 games. Both of these guys have been up and down. We've seen good things and we've seen bad things. So for now, they both have to be fringe starts in a matchup against the Eagles. And for as frustrating as those guys are right now, you gotta probably admit that A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are far more frustrating to own. At least the Eagles are trying to get A.J. Brown more involved now. He's got 21 targets over his last 2 games. Devontae Smith, he disappeared a couple of weeks ago, but he was back with a top 24 performance last week and saw 11 targets. So both of these guys are going to continue to be up and down. Does A.J. Brown have a better ceiling than Devontae Smith? I believe he does. But I also think that, take it for what it's worth, Devontae Smith has a better floor than A.J. Brown, and I'm using better and floor loosely. San Francisco gets a tough matchup against Cleveland this week. Brock Purdy did not look great last week against Carolina. Juwan Jennings in this matchup will be a fringe start for me, but we haven't seen a ton from Ricky Pearsall as of yet. He almost had a touchdown last week, but unfortunately the defender jumped him and intercepted the pass. He could still be coming with some really nice fantasy value the rest of the season with some good matchups. This week is not it though. I would love to pick a Cleveland wide receiver to use this week. Going up against San Francisco, who's currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, this would be the type of matchup where we would take a shot with somebody. But it's hard to. Last week, all the wide receivers played 65% or less of the snaps, and they only attempted 20 passes with Shedeur Sanders. Do they open it up a little bit more this week? Do they try to run the football more this week? Is it a negative game script? Is it more neutral? Fannin led the team last week with 6 targets, and then right behind him was Jerry Jeudy at 3, Tillman had 3, and Bond had 2. So do we really want to chase wide receivers who are barely on the field 60% of the time, who only get 3 to 4 targets per game, and haven't shown a ton of upside this season? I don't think it's the time to be chasing any of these guys. Jacksonville gets a solid matchup against Tennessee this week, who's allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we'll need to keep an eye on Brian Thomas this week. Will he be able to return? As of right now, listed as questionable, Parker Washington, Jakobi Meyers. I could see both of these guys giving us fantasy value this week. Now, let's say Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't play this week. Parker Washington moves to being a must start for me. He's definitely a guy with a lot of top 24 potential due to volume and a good matchup. Jakobi Meyers would stay as a fringe start. He's a little bit more touchdown dependent for me. Now, if Brian Thomas Jr. were to play, that's where things become really difficult. And at that point, you're throwing darts. Brian Thomas Jr., Parker Washington, Jakobi Meyers, I would have all of them as fringe starts. The player that I would least anticipate having a great game, believe it or not, would be Brian Thomas Jr. Him and Trevor Lawrence weren't even on the same page before Parker Washington and Jakobi Meyers were playing well. The safest wide receiver for me would be Parker Washington because I feel like he has the most big play potential and the most potential for volume. Jakobi Meyers, for me, he would have a little bit of both. I think he's got touchdown potential whether or not Brian Thomas Jr. plays, but I do think his floor could be slightly under Parker Washington. Chimere Dike is the one guy that I continue to see question after question about because people are like, why don't you give Dike more love? And it's because a lot of you that are asking that question play in a league that offer you fantasy points for return yards. If you play in a league that offers you fantasy points for return yards, then Dike is a guy that has been very solid all season long. But you're in the minority. A majority of people that play fantasy football do not play in leagues that offer fantasy points for return yards. You would only get fantasy points if you were to score a return touchdown. So for a lot of people watching this video, Dike doesn't have a ton of upside, but he does have 3 top 24 performances in his last 5 games. And he was solid last week, 44 yards, 1 receiving touchdown. Going up against Jacksonville this week, could be some negative game script. Dike could be solid again with Cam Ward coming off of his best performance as a professional so far. Houston will be playing at Indianapolis, and this has the makings of a very good game, one of which that could see some decent offense. The other one could end up being a whole lot of defense, and if that happens, it's going to kill a lot of value. Nico Collins only had 3 targets last week, but it was the first time in 4 games that he didn't see 10 or more targets. So the volume continues to be there. He's a start. They'll get back to him this week. Absolutely. They're not going to go back-to-back weeks without looking at their number 1 wide receiver. For Jaden Higgins, he's going to be a fringe start. He saw 9 targets last week, which is solid, but it's the touchdown potential that gives him the opportunity to be fantasy viable right now. He has at least 7 targets in 3 straight games and in 4 of his last 5 games. He also has scored a touchdown every other week since week 4. Now, if you go by those standards, he won't score a touchdown this week, but it's clear they're looking at him in the red zone a whole lot more often, and his volume is starting to go up. For Indianapolis, I really don't want to risk it with any of these wide receivers. If you own Michael Pittman, I think you could use him as a wide receiver 3 or as a flex option this week, but you really have to have other guys around him that offer him more upside. The touchdown potential is there. After scoring last week, he now has a career high in touchdowns this season. So he is by far the best bet of any of the wide receivers here. Alec Pierce may only catch 1 or 2 passes this week. They could end up going for 40 to 80 yards. So there is some upside play, but it's very risky going up against a defense currently allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. New Orleans is facing Miami, who's currently allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but that's not going to stop us from listing Chris Olave as a start this week. 108 targets on the season. Is 2nd most in the league. That is a whole lot of targets, and he hasn't found his upside all season long, but here, as of recent, he's definitely had an opportunity for some bigger plays. He's the only wide receiver we're starting in New Orleans right now. Some of you out there still have a sour taste in your mouth because Jalen Waddle couldn't get anything done against a Washington defense that can't stop anybody, it seems like, right before their bye. But Jalen Waddle is still the wide receiver 13 on the season since Tyreek Hill went down with his injury. So once again, he's going to be a safe start for us this week. We're going to have a lot to keep an eye on for Atlanta this week when it comes to Drake London. As of right now, my gut feeling is telling me that Drake London will not play, but it's been a strange season, and you never know what could happen over the next several days. So we're going to list him as questionable. If he does play, he's going to be a fringe start for us, just because we are not 100% sure how healthy he is. But for those of you that own Drake London, you're probably going to play him regardless because of the potential. If Drake London is out, is Darnell Mooney a start? No. Is he a fringe start? He probably should be. Is he a safe start? No, absolutely not. Outside of that 49-yard reception last week, he didn't really do anything. He only had 3 targets, so you really got to hope for the big play once again. We're going to go ahead and put John Mechie as a fringe start this week, which sounds really weird considering the fact that he's John Mechie, and he plays for the New York Jets. He's not a safe play by any means, but he has touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, and he's been a top 24 wide receiver each of the last couple of weeks. If you're looking for somebody as a wide receiver 3, if you have to play 3 wide receivers, he could be a guy that you would look at if the waiver wire is thin for you this week. If you're in a league where you have to play 2 flex options, then maybe you could flex him as your second option, again, in a league where the waiver wire is very thin. They're going to end up being a whole lot of good, or there could end up being a whole lot of ugly. And for this matchup, when it comes to the wide receivers, we've got a lot that we're keeping our eye on. That's why Arizona at Tampa Bay is going to be my underdog must-watch matchup for the wide receiver position here in Week 13. And the projections for the wide receivers in this game could swing wildly throughout the week as we wait to hear word on whether or not guys will end up playing, like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Baker Mayfield. But if you're interested in trying to take advantage of any of the projections for this matchup or any of the other matchups that we talk about throughout the week, you're going to want to do so over on Underdog. Come check out all of the picks that we're playing throughout the week over on Underdog as a community. And right now, if you get signed up over on Underdog and make a deposit of at least $10 while signing up with code HEADLINERS, you're going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit this week. You compare that with any of the other pick'ems that we talk about. But as soon as you play your first game, you're also going to get up to $100 in bonus bets as well. And for anyone out there that feels like their fantasy season just didn't go the way that they would like, playing with us over on Underdog is a way to definitely leave 2025 feeling a whole lot better about football. We'll be keeping an eye on Marvin Harrison Jr. this week. As of right now, he's still going to be listed as questionable, and it sounded like he may only miss a couple of weeks after his appendectomy, but there hasn't been a ton of updates. So as of this recording, still not 100% sure if he's going to play this week. If you have Marvin Harrison Jr., you definitely want him back in a matchup against Tampa Bay, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But if you were one of those people that grabbed Michael Wilson off the waivers, you may not want Marvin Harrison back nearly as much. Dortch had 9 targets last week, and he caught 6 of them for 53 yards and a touchdown. Michael Wilson's been insane. Over the last 2 weeks, 33 targets, 25 receptions, and 303 receiving yards. If Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't play this week, Michael Wilson is for sure a start. Greg Dortch will be a fringe start because of the matchup. Here's where things get interesting. If Marvin Harrison Jr. does play this week, I'm going to leave Michael Wilson as a start. I think him and Jacoby Brissett are on the same page right now, and that's not going to change. Marvin Harrison Jr., because of the matchup, will be a fringe start, while Greg Dortch will move to a sit. Right now, it is really hard to give you a ton of analysis on the wide receivers for Tampa Bay, because we don't know if Baker Mayfield is going to play this week. It sounds like he avoided major injury, and from all indications from what I read this morning, it sounds like Tampa Bay is really hoping that he will play. But we're going to have to see him in practice and see just how healthy he is before we start really diving into this. Because if Baker Mayfield does play, going up against Arizona, Emeka Egbuka is definitely going to be a start. Even though he hasn't been that great over the last few weeks, he's still going to be a start. Chris Godwin will move to a fringe start. They've made the comment that he is going to see an increase in his workload this week. Tez Johnson, unfortunately at that point, would go to being a sit for me because I think there's just way too much reliance on him needing to score a touchdown. And I really don't want to bank on that this week. I would rather take a look at Egbuka and Godwin. However, if Teddy Bridgewater ends up starting, I'm not starting Tez Johnson, I'm not starting Chris Godwin, and at best, Emeka Egbuka is a fringe option that you might have to play as your wide receiver too, but will not feel great about. Carolina may be allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game, and they may have caused 3 interceptions last week for Bryce Young, but Matthew Stafford is playing a whole different game of football right now. And with that being said, Davante Adams and Puka Nacua are definitely both going to be starts. I don't care how tough the matchup is. Davante Adams, he has touchdown potential. Puka Nacua could see 8 to 10 targets every single week. For Carolina, it's a way tougher matchup against the LA Rams this week than it was against San Francisco, and they just could not get anything going against San Francisco. Bryce Young could have some trouble once again, and because of that, it's going to make all these guys super risky. Tet McMillan is only going to be a fringe start for me this week. It's really hard to tell what's going to happen with Minnesota this week. After their game last week, J.J. McCarthy was surprisingly placed in the concussion protocol. And there's a lot of people that think that that was because that J.J. McCarthy has been so bad as of recent that he's actually being benched, and this is an excuse not to play him. If J.J. McCarthy is not cleared and can't play this week, undrafted free agent rookie Max Brosmer will end up playing, and I don't know if that's any better. Some of you might think it is, and some of you might be like, heck yeah, he's going to be the guy to unlock Justin Jefferson. I'll list Justin Jefferson as a fringe start just because he's so good that at any point in time he could absolutely go off. Jordan Addison may have a little touchdown potential this week. With either of these guys, though, unfortunately, everybody's risky. JSN might be the best wide receiver in all of football right now. It's a tough matchup against Minnesota. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. JSN has been over 100 yards in all but 3 games this season. He's been over 90 yards in all but 1 game this season, and he's been over 70 receiving yards in every game this season. Buffalo gets a great matchup for their wide receivers this week, going up against Pittsburgh, who currently allow the most fantasy points per game to the position. But we don't even know what's going on here. Is Keon Coleman going to play? He was inactive the last couple of weeks for a coach's decision because they're just not happy with how he's handling himself in the building and off the football field. I'm going to list him as out because I don't even know if he's actually even going to be activated this week. Khalil Shakir, I'll start him. He's been the one guy this season that I don't know if we'll say we could rely on, but has the best potential every single week. Tyrell Shavers, he had a big week then disappeared. Gabe Davis, he's back with his former quarterback, so he could see a big play here or there. But realistically, when you look at the matchup, you want to play this team. But Khalil Shakir is the only one that I would bank on. DK Metcalf left last week temporarily with a mild ankle sprain, and it sounds like he's going to be good to go, and he returned to the game. We'll mark him down with an injury, but we're going to just keep an eye on it throughout the week in case anything pops up. As far as this matchup goes, though, are we getting Mason Rudolph or are we getting Aaron Rodgers? If we get Aaron Rodgers, DK Metcalf is a safer fringe start, and you could probably even list Calvin Austin as a fringe start if you wanted to. If they start Mason Rudolph, I probably would go ahead and skip on Calvin Austin, even though he led the team last week, and DK Metcalf would be a very risky play as like a wide receiver 3 flex option. The LA Chargers are coming out of the bye, and they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. What does that mean? Not a whole lot of great things for the Las Vegas Raiders wide receivers. Trey Tucker had 10 targets last week. He could only turn him into 3 receptions. Tyler Lockett saw some of that old connection with Geno Smith. He had 4 receptions and 62 yards on 5 targets. Chip Kelly is not the offensive coordinator anymore. You're probably going to see some changes to what they do on offense. Ashton Jeanty may not end up playing, and it's already a tough matchup. Personally, I probably wouldn't risk it with either of these guys. The Raiders, however, are giving up the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Ladd McConkey, I will lock him back in as being a start this week. Justin Herbert, we're going to have to keep an eye out for him. I haven't really heard a whole lot, but he was injured prior to the bye week. Not a ton of indication on whether or not he would end up missing this week, so I'm operating under the assumption he will play, which will be good. The offensive line is banged up, which is making things a little bit more difficult for this offense, but Ladd McConkey is the one guy that we've been able to trust as of recent. Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston are both fringe starts, because if you start Keenan Allen, you're hoping for like 5 fantasy points, but you understand he's not going to go much higher than 10. If you start Quentin Johnston, you're hoping for like 11 to 15 fantasy points, but understanding he might get 0. Sunday Night Football, Denver and Washington, and for the Denver wide receivers, I think it's fair to ask, is Courtland Sutton still the wide receiver 1? Or is it Troy Franklin now? It's a great matchup for these guys, going up against Washington, who's allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But as of recent, Franklin has had much more upside than Courtland Sutton. Franklin has been the wide receiver 23, 1, 50, 25, and 20 over the last 5 weeks. Courtland Sutton has been the wide receiver 18, 37, 30, 58, and 32. Even though Jaden Daniels is practicing this week, they've already announced that he will not be playing, so we've got another week of Marcus Mariota. Also, Terry McLaurin is back at practice this week. No indication on whether or not he will actually play, but he is practicing. For this week, I'm going to play it safe with this matchup. If Terry McLaurin plays, I'm not going to play Terry McLaurin. He's not going into my lineup. It's way too difficult of a matchup. Denver allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game. I'm not interested in it. If you're playing Deebo Samuel, you're assuming a ton of risk and you're knowing that he has to score a touchdown. And I think based on how difficult of a matchup this is, that if for some reason Washington can get into the red zone, they could drop a play or two that could get Deebo into the end zone. The Giants and the Patriots will be on Monday Night Football this week, and for the Giants, they hope to have Jackson Dart back. And I think if you own Wan'Dale Robinson, you probably hope for a lot of the same, even though Jameis Winston did hook him up with a lot of targets last week. The issue is yeah, he was the wide receiver 2 last week. Great week against Detroit, and we know Jameis Winston slings it. But over the previous 4 games, he didn't finish any higher than wide receiver 32. So he hasn't even had close to that type of upside as of recent. If Jackson Dart can play, I think in this matchup against the Patriots, he really is the best option to give Wan'Dale Robinson the highest upside. He's going to be a start for me, whether it's Dart or it's Winston. But just know that the ceiling isn't what it was last week. The New York Giants defense might look a little bit different. They just fired their defensive coordinator, and they're going to look to get things back on track after Detroit absolutely ripped them up through the air and on the ground. They are still giving up the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which would be good for Stephon Diggs or Kayshon Boutte or even Matt Collins if it wasn't for the fact that 9 players had at least 1 target in last week's game for New England. Now, Hunter Henry led the team with 10 targets, and there's no way that he's getting 10 targets again this week. So I would expect the wide receivers to have a little bit of a better floor this week than they did last week. If I had to guess on how things are going to go, I would say Stephon Diggs is the best combination of high upside and best floor. I would say Matt Collins, given the targets that he has had recently, may have the best floor, but not really that much of an upside. Kayshon Boutte, don't love his floor whatsoever, but the touchdown potential is the best on the team, giving him the highest ceiling. Headliner Nation, I hope you all are getting ready to have a fantastic Thanksgiving week. Do not forget to pre-order your draft guide on Black Friday so you get the best price of the season. We are hard at work here behind the scenes right now. We have to have all of our videos done by Wednesday night, which is a lot of videos, so I'm gonna get back to work. If y'all could do me a favor on the way out, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notifications, hype the video if you have any hype points left. Headliner Nation, stay safe and stay healthy this week, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.